It's my pleasure this afternoon to introduce our moderator, Francis Lamb, David Gelb, Grant Achatz, Nick Kokonis, and Brian McGinn.
Yes.
All right, the water is pre-poured. This is a class operation. Actually, you know, it's funny because I was watching, I remember this moment when I used to be a cook, a restaurant cook, not a very good one. And I remember this one day when I was just like getting hammered, just getting totally crushed on the line, and the chef was totally riding me, and me and the other guy in the station were like grumbling because like the chef was in a bad mood, and I go, Jesus Christ, man, it's just food. We're not saving fucking lives here. And then the dude on the other end of the line was like, he was literally an EMT before he became a cook, and he actually said, this is actually a more stressful job. But I want to thank you, Grant, for ruining that clapback that every amateur cook will one day want to give a chef, and you'd be like, well, guess what? Grant ruined that story. But thank you so much for coming. Thank you for making the film, and thank you for being. I actually want to, here are the rules of the conversation, right? I'm going to ask a question. I may address it to someone, but you can always jump in. We'll have about 20 minutes, and then we're going to turn it to y'all. So think of interesting things you want to ask of the people on stage. So the first question, David, I'm going to address you, but certainly you and Brian. Again, anyone else can jump in. But this is season 2 of Chef's Table. And I remember we spoke when season 1 came out. And in our conversation, I actually went all the way back to when you made Jiro Dreams of Sushi. And I said to you, you know, I knew so many people watch this film. If in case you don't know, it's this beautiful film about a sushi chef in Japan named Jiro, who's quite old and an extraordinary master. And everyone's like, oh my God, that was like the greatest piece of food porn, or like, it was like 2 hours, you're just watching like fish dance. And I watched the movie and it was beautiful, so I understand why people said that. But in my mind, it was this almost tragic story of what happens when someone is so completely obsessed with mastery and the sort of emotional costs of that, that they might bear or that the people around them might bear. And we talked about this and you said, that's what I think Chef Table is. It's not necessarily just about the food. It's not about these beautiful dishes flying around. It's about these human stories. So now season 2, and you're working on further seasons, many episodes in, many chefs in. What is it about chefs? And what is it that chefs are teaching you about the world?
Well, man, I think that chefs are inspiring because they take incredible risks, and Nick as well takes an incredible risk as well, because it's such a hard job, as you know. But being an owner of a restaurant is even harder. And so I think that I'm inspired by chefs because they take these incredible risks, because they have visions and they'll stop at nothing to realize them. You know, so I think it's kind of it doesn't necessarily have to be about food. I think that it applies to many different types of creative people. I think that food is something that is very interesting. Everybody has to eat. Everybody wants to eat. And so the chefs provide something that is kind of this universally desired, you know, object. And but watching them and kind of the dishes themselves, we don't really like to call it food porn. We kind of call it more of like food romance. Because porn kind of is like, there's no real emotional context. You know, somebody needs to get their TV fixed, and then, you know, their repairman shows up. And that's pretty much as deep as the story goes. But we try to instill emotional context in the creation itself. And so the dishes that you'll see in this film and you'll see in the other films in the series all have to do, they're linked to the chef's biography and their origin. And I think that the core of the show has so much to do with the origin story of our chefs. And our chefs, and I've said this before, but I think that our chefs are all like superheroes. I mean, the things that Grant can do, nobody else in the world can do. And how did he gain those superpowers? And I think that we really try to dig into that and try to, find the spark that started it. Yeah. So it's really a human journey, and the food is really just the product of that, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
Are you looking at me to add to that?
Yeah.
I think that one of the things that we talked about kind of at the beginning of the show was that, and I think this kind of expands on what you're saying, is we're looking for people who work with the same passion that they live. So one of the things that was really interesting about Jiro, I think, is that he not only spent every day trying to improve his craft, but he actually lived in that same kind of monk-like way, right? Like there was very little separation between the way that he worked and the way that he lived. And I think you see that a lot in people, maybe filmmakers as well, who are obsessive workers and constantly trying to get better, is there's a real deep connection between the way that we live and the way that we work. And I think that passion is what's really exciting about Grant. It's definitely, obviously, the other element that's exciting is he's throwing it all away to start over again, which is awesome, and something that we're all doing because now we're going to make more films. But yeah, I think that kind of expands on that.
What do you mean by, okay, so the throwing it away thing is interesting. Because
Yeah.
I think what you're alluding to is the fact that Grant and Nick have closed the linea. Is that what you're alluding to?
Yeah, and this idea that, okay, I'm going to spend the last 10 years of Alinea creating iconic things that everyone all over the world wants to eat, and then I'm not going to make those anymore because I want to do something that's rewarding to me, and that continues to find new pleasures to give to other people and new things to explore, and that's something we can all aspire to do. I mean, you're really alive if you do that.
But there's also another piece of that I think is so interesting about being a chef, and that is, if you think of your work as art or some kind of artistic expression, it's also an artistic expression that exists for a moment, right? And you have to produce it and reproduce it 75 times a night, 125 times a night, however many times a night, and it exists for that moment. And the moment it sits down in front of the customer, it's going to be eaten, it's going to be consumed, it's going to be thought about. You have no control over what happens to it, and you'll never see it again, right? I think there's something.
Yeah, well, in that sense, our job is easy because this was pre-recorded and pre-edited, and we just have to hit play, whereas, Grant and his team have to keep that up. Like it's like a Broadway show almost, and they have to keep on.
It's more performance than it's production. I think that's super, and people don't think of it in those terms because I feel like this sense of, oh, you're back there and you're making the thing. They think of making with the hands, and there's always product when you make with the hands. But what you're making disappears, it always disappears. So it might as well not exist in some way, except for what happens, like what fires between the synapses of the guest's mind in the 8 minutes it takes them to eat a dish. Grant, when we spoke, when these guys were here shooting with you, you were nervous. What were you nervous about?
I think probably one of the more difficult things for a chef to do is define what they do and explain where it came from. It's a really hard, I find that for the most part, we're very reactive and it's very intuitive. And even though we analyze it and we break it apart and we do research and we read cookbooks and we go online and we see what other chefs are doing and we learn the fundamentals of cooking and we try to make ourselves expand and innovate, it's really hard to explain. And they're storytellers, right? And they're trying to capture the story behind, they're pulling back the curtain to show all of you what we do creatively. And I was afraid that we weren't going to be able to articulate that. That was one of my biggest fears.
Luckily, Grant, one of the most articulate people on earth, so he really didn't need to be worried about that. But
Yeah.
But that, it's interesting you said that because Brian, because you also mentioned to me that you did far more hours of interviews for this episode than any other.
That was my fault.
Nick and I are actually still in the process of our interview, yeah.
The phone recorder's on right now. It's like,
Yeah.
okay, Nick, what are you going to say? But I think, but in today's world, like chefs, or at least chefs who of a certain level or want to exist in a certain sort of, whatever, chefs who play the game, who play the media game, and they know that the media and how the media covers you is inherently tied to your success, but also like what you do in a lot of ways now, right? And I think chefs who want to play that game or understand the necessity of playing that game tend to get pretty good at, honing their talking points. They tend to understand that what the media is dying for is a narrative. Like, you need a story, and I want you to talk about me, so I'm going to give you a story. And they build that narrative, and they know how to hammer it over and over and over again. A lot of what I saw on the screen today felt very raw. It felt very real. It felt, some of the things I'd heard Grant talk about, some of the things I've talked with Grant about and Nick about, a lot of it wasn't. As an interviewer or as a director, how do you encourage people to get to that point? And as an interviewee, when do you feel safe or comfortable, or hey, here's the moment where I'm going to let it come out, and I don't care if it's, the pre-scripted version that I always felt was the thing I need to say to people.
Well, I think hour 14 is the answer to that. No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, when you're interviewing someone, I mean, especially someone like Grant and someone like Nick, both of whom have done a lot of press, they've written a book, a great book. I think that the challenge is always, how are you going to get them to understand that you really care and that you're interested in more than just a blurb answer? Because I think the other thing is that the majority of coverage of chefs is short form. So it's an article that's a page or 2 pages. And so, they're looking for a couple of tidbits and then to get out of there, right? And what we're trying to do is actually understand who these people are. And we actually choose who's going to direct the episodes based on who has the most passion for the person and who is the most interested in that story. And so I kind of came at this, I've been fascinated by Grant for many years, and it was really exciting for me to get the chance to talk to him at length. So it wasn't even so much, how am I going to break down this interview subject? It was, I actually enjoy talking to Grant, and so I'm going to talk to him for as long as I conceivably can, while being responsible as a director, knowing that I have to finish a TV episode at the end of the day.
And, I mean, we say no to 98% of the stuff, but in this case, you see the quality of what they've already made, both Jiro and the first season, and in talking to them for 5 minutes, you very quickly understand that they're coming at it from exactly what you just said, a really sincere point of view. And so at that point, you just have to trust that they know their craft like he knows his.
And I think that, there are hours of interviews that I've done with Grant where we were not even talking about things that were really ever going to go in the show. And it was just about building that relationship, because I actually cared about that outside of the show. And I think maybe that's the answer to the question, is you have to care not about the final product, but actually about what you're talking about.
And we still talk.
Yeah.
That's the weird part.
It is weird.
Oh, sorry.
Please.
When you bring up 14 hours of interviews, which is not really normal on the show, but that's kind of Brian's style, which is kind of amazing. I just think maybe it's a good time to give a shout out to the editor.
Yes,
who-
Jesse.
and the rest of your crew.
Okay, so Jesse Overman and Claire, I'm going to pronounce this terribly poorly, Claire Degrasse, who both did an amazing job going through 14 hours of me yammering with Grant and Nick and everyone. They did a great job, and I also think it's good to shout out the whole rest of our team. Adam Bricker, who is the DP of the episode, who did a beautiful job. Andrew Freed, who is David and my third partner in crime on the show. Dane Lilligard, who keeps all of us together and is a big part of our team. And I mean, there's an endless amount of people we could go on forever.
Duncan Thumb, who does all the music.
Did amazing job with the music, which was really beautiful. I remember he was talking about how he actually tried to get in Grant's head to break down the music in the same way that Grant would break down dishes with. thought was really cool.
And also the entire team at Boardwalk Pictures. I'm really glad to have you out here. And our good friends at Netflix who allow us to make this our job, which is kind of crazy, and we're very grateful for it, so thank you guys.
And the whole team at Alinea, a lot of whom are here tonight, Mike Bagale, Mike Bagel, Simon Davies, Gary, and John, and the whole team of guys. Thank you so much for being welcoming to us.
So now that you've thanked everyone for who have made this film and this series of films possible, I want to talk to Nick, who I know secretly wants to blow the whole operation up and do it his way. Nick, I remember we had a conversation once where, alluding to what you said, or calling back to what you said before, where you told me a handful of people in production companies who had come to you over the years and said, "Oh, we'd love to do this show with you, or do this movie with you," and da 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 da. And you told me, and we said no to them. We said no to them. We said no to them. And I remember thinking, like my main reaction at that moment was, I can't believe you say no to all these people. And it's been an instructive moment in my life, so I want to thank you for it, because I learned what I feel is the first lesson in the Kokona School of Business, which is always be happy to walk away from a deal. I've never actually put that into play because I'm a wuss, but I like the idea that I want to be more like Nick Kokonas one day. But the other thing that happened is, for each one of those examples, you said, well, because they wanted to do this, and I thought if they were going to do that, they should really do this. And every time I thought, legit, like you have a better sounding idea. So if you were to make Chef's Table,
Oh, God.
and make it better, or just make it different, how would you do it?
Yeah, so I have to say Netflix is genius, because you're going to be able to binge watch Chef's Table on May 27th, I believe, and yet they still managed to put it into this circuit, and that's a really, really smart thing to do. A lot of the things for us is that we try to tell stories and keep people emotionally engaged, and everything that David described at the first question is pretty much exactly the same thing that we try to do. And so when people don't know what they want at the beginning, and they talk about the process they're going to go through, but they don't know the story that they want to tell, that's a really good thing. A lot of times people want to shoehorn our story or Grant's story or Alinea into something that fits what they're doing. And if you look at Chef's Table, every single one of them is different, and they're really good at telling the story of those people in a responsible way. So I'm going to sound like such a wimp here, but we said yes to this one. So at the end of the day, it's always scary, I think, to put yourself in front of a camera. I know, it's a bit like going through psychotherapy. That, the necessary emotionally backscarring story, the emotionally scarring backstory, as my 13-year-old son Theo calls it, is really prominent in this episode, and obviously everything that Grant went through. And you want to make sure that that's done in service of what we're actually trying to do. It's not a cancer story. It's a story of a restaurant and a chef and making people happy every day. Mm-hmm. And so I think they just came at it from that perspective, which was great. So it was an easy way to say yes. And sitting down with these guys, they're interested in a whole bunch of things beyond just making a show.
Yeah.
I was really interested by the fact that when Grant got cancer, he actually ended up learning a bunch from it that then instructed the restaurant. And I had never read that anywhere in any story. And the story has been covered in a lot of different places, and I just thought that was really interesting. That then you can look around and you can say, oh, what Mike is doing over here is really cool, or what Simon is doing over here is really cool. And that kind of widening of a field of vision is a really amazing thing, and I think it instructs the first 20 minutes of the movie, where you're seeing a lot of what Alinea is doing today. It's really coming from that team effort, which is pretty amazing. So that was really exciting to me, to find a different angle on the thing that has been talked about a lot.
Yeah. And Grant, this is a little bit embarrassing for me to say about you while you're sitting right here, but
Awesome.
I think I think I wrote this even in a story about my first experience at Alinea many years ago for Gourmet, and I think the line I wrote was, I think Achatz is a genius, and I don't use that word lightly. And I think one of the hallmarks of genius is someone who whose perspective on the world is one in which literally everything helps inform what you do. And so you take all this information, all this stimulus from the world, whatever form it comes in, whether in an artistic discipline like the beginning of the film shows, or an intense personal and scary experience, and you can somehow convert that and make it into a thing that you then play with, an idea. You abstract it into this idea, and then it comes out into these specific things. In your case, it's food, it's dishes. But I think it's obviously more than food, it's more than dishes. It's this experience that you talk about. And again, going back to my first experience at Alinea, which was I think in 2006, maybe 2007. No, you opened
05.
Oh, you opened 05, yeah, so maybe it was 07. I remember going in, and so much of what I heard about the restaurant was, oh, it's this awesome molecular gastronomy restaurant, right? And at that time, the focus on that kind of cooking was they do crazy stuff with technology you've never heard of before, and so the important thing, or the thing that's gonna wow you, is you've just never seen this stuff before. It's a lot of flashbang and wizardry. And sure, that has been a part of what you do because it's about newness, and that's exciting and fun and all that stuff. But what I came away with was how incredibly emotional experience it was. And I remember writing about that, and I remember when you and I had our first real conversation, you had read that I wrote that, and you said, I'm so happy to read that because not that many people talk about that part of what we do.
Right.
That the experience of Alinea is meant to be an emotional one. And now it's funny because fast forward almost 10 years later, and I feel like that's such a buzzword in what restaurants of many stripes do. They talk about the emotional experience of their restaurant and how they want to feel. And if when Alinea was new, if in some sense that was the innovation of introducing an emotional aspect to the experience of dinner, in 2016, everyone's talking about how emotional coming to my burger joint is. What is the next new thing?
For us?
Yeah.
Or in general?
No, yeah, for you. Not like trend casting, but like, talk about what is it that continues to inspire, motivate, and drive you? What drives you crazy?
Not moving. And I think that's why we took that risk and ripped apart something that was working nearly perfectly for 10 years and shut it down, tore it right down to 4 walls and built it back up, because it gives us the opportunity to stop the rhythm. To me, the rhythm is like, it's like muscle memory. It's the same, that repetition somehow becomes mindless. It's like brushing your teeth. You probably do the same pattern. Somebody should map this. You should video your brushing your teeth every morning. You probably do it about the same every time. And so to interrupt that repetition, that pattern, not only is it exciting because we get to create a new restaurant, but it's exciting because we don't actually, like Nick said, we don't know what we created yet.
Also, the times when we were most productive and when the culinary team's most productive and the business team's most productive is frankly when we're terrified a little bit.
Yeah.
And I remember when I walked in January 4th this year and it had been ripped apart, I wanted to say, whoa, no, put it all back together, because we really didn't know what we're gonna do. And people ask me every day now, what is it gonna be? And the only thing I can say is it's gonna be different. And we hope it's gonna be even better and more progressive and great, but we honestly don't know. And that's, to me, when we've come together as a team and do the best work.
And I think that ties in what David was saying earlier about taking risk, and you have to for us, we found it time to force ourselves to the point of no return, putting ourselves in that position where we don't exactly know.
What I do know is that nothing in there exists anymore.
Right.
Like quite literally, not a single.
The two of you.
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
I guess. Right.
One table.
And one table.
That's
We
it.
saved one table for nostalgic reasons.
That's kind
Yeah.
of awesome. Yeah. I mean, I when I was a teacher, I remember there was this thing that, like, the teachers that I was working with, we'd always kick around with each other and we'd say, discomfort is the nature of learning, right? If you're comfortable, that means you're not learning. You have to be stretching yourself. And with that, I think we have a few moments to go to the audience for questions, right? So I don't have a system for this, so maybe hands or jump and yell, or over there.
Hi, my question is for Grant and Nick. How easy or difficult is it for you emotionally to rip everything apart and rebuild it or renew it? So intellectually, you know that you need to do that, but emotionally, is that easy for you, or is that something very difficult?
I think for me, it was what you would expect. I mean, walking through there on New Year's Eve this past year was knowing that it would never be the same again, ever, was made me a little bit sad, you know? Not only, we've all kind of touched on it, but not only was it this realization of a dream that I had had for a long time, but many other things in my life had happened during that 10-year period. So you kind of have no choice but to reflect on those as this physical thing is being torn down. You kind of reflect on your personal life. But I said to Nick the other day, right before we came to New York, walking through the space now when it's 90%, 95% done, and feeling that same excitement and that same passion that I had in May of 2005 when we were about to open, I have not felt that feeling for 11 years. And now I walked through the other day and I felt it again. So quintessentially bittersweet.
We did, however, argue for 8 straight months about whether to do it or not.
Right.
So the answer is it's
There's a
scary
little
as hell.
angst.
Yeah, it's a little angst there, yeah.
Another? Over there. Yes, you. No, sorry. Well, sorry. I don't know. Row 9. I don't know what
Decide.
This is.
Hi, this question is for Grant and Nick. My name is Monica. I was born and raised in Chicago. And I noticed that you've covered most of the senses in your restaurant, you know, taste, smell, sight, vision, or touch. I just want to know, like, what are your plans for sound in your art?
Funny you should ask.
I don't want to hear this.
We did put in a sound system into the new Alinea. There's 5 zones of sound, each dining room. It's tricky because if you start playing sound in one, it's not like you have a theater and it's a collective experience. Everyone's going at different times. We're going to figure out what to do with it.
We have some ideas, but they're not. We have some ideas.
A different Def Leppard album in every room.
Right.
It's going to be awesome.
No, we recently did kind of a pet project in the interim before reopening Alinea called The Progression in Chicago. And we most definitely played with concepts that we have always been intrigued by and we thought might come into play at some point in Alinea. And one of the major components was sound and light in a pretty extreme fashion and how they might be incorporated into the creative process into Alinea. So with great success. We had a lot of fun with Progression, and I think it was very informative to things that are to come.
Right here in front, please.
To Grant and Nick, can you tell us about restaurants and chefs around the world that have inspired you, that you've been amazed by, meals that you've drawn inspirations from?
I mean, the list is really endless. It can run the gamut from, a two-table restaurant in Tokyo to a diner that does something really well, or there's a certain aspect of that experience that is unique or evocative to me personally. I think now, for me, it becomes, Francis and I have joked about this a bit, and Brian and I certainly talked about it, Nick and I talk about it. It's not, if you're a chef that isn't paying attention to sustainability and the eco issues that are present today, then you're not doing your job. If you're a chef that doesn't try their hardest to cook really well and season really well and do the best in the genre of cooking that you're in, then you're not really doing your job. So those, in my mind, in the team's mind, are kind of a given. What we look at now are more experiences and concepts. Those are the driving force, not what is the lamb going to go with fava beans or English peas?
Yeah, I mean, also
It's more conceptual.
Yeah, and the problem now is with the internet, with Chef's Table, with everything, it's really hard to defy expectations. And so I think the best meals that any of us have are the ones where you're most surprised and pleasantly so. And you just have a great time because something wonderful and unexpected's happened.
And that's like the trio meal for you.
Yes.
Yeah. Because the restaurant was it was like a boarding house?
Yeah, the juxtaposition of everything. So that's part of the challenge of, with instant, I'm sure the day we reopen Alinea, there's going to be a million pictures on Instagram, and everyone's going to know exactly what the new restaurant looks like. And that's great. I mean, it's a great thing, and I love the internet, and I'll be one of the people looking at those. It also diminishes the experience a little bit.
Are you going to put in a Wi-Fi blocker? It's a dead zone in the restaurant.
There's a phone check in the beginning.
Right.
We'd love to take your coat and your phone. All right, but I'm sorry to say, I think we're out of time. But thank you so much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the film. And thank you to...
Thank you.
Thank you.
Come out beautifully.
Thank you.
And thank you to Tribeca for having us back.
One
Really
more
appreciate it.
thank you also. Bri Guthrie really helped us out and did an amazing job. So thank you, Bri.